I came home from my mother's funeral with dirt still on my shoes and grief still choking my chest, and 5 minutes later, I heard my family planning how to erase me from my own life. The house smelled like incense and old furniture, but nothing felt familiar anymore. My mother's voice was gone. Her presence was gone, and somehow in that silence I realized I had never been more alone. I closed the door quietly behind me, loosened my black tie, and stood there for a second, trying to breathe like a normal human being. That's when I heard my aunt laugh from the living room. Not a sad laugh, not a broken one. A relieved laugh. "He doesn't suspect a thing," she said. I froze. My uncle replied calmly, "Of course he doesn't. He just buried his mother." I didn't move, I didn't breathe. I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. "We'll get the papers signed tomorrow," my brother added. "He'll do whatever we tell him. He's weak right now." Weak. That word cut deeper than the grave I had just watched being filled. What they didn't know, what none of them could imagine, was that I had come home with something else besides grief. Inside my coat pocket was an envelope my mother had pressed into my hand 2 days before she died. She had been struggling to breathe, her fingers trembling as she held onto me. "Don't open this until I'm gone," she whispered. "And don't trust anyone, not even blood." I had opened it alone after the funeral, sitting in my car unable to drive. Inside were documents, legal papers, signatures, and a letter written in my mother's handwriting. She had left everything to me: the house, the land, her savings, even a small trust she had quietly built over years. Everything was legally mine, and at the bottom of the letter one line burned into my mind: "If they find out, so let them think they've won." Standing behind that wall, hearing my own family discuss how to strip me of my future, something inside me broke. Not loudly, not violently, it was a silent fracture, the kind that changes a person forever. Over the next few days I played my role perfectly. I didn't argue, I didn't question anything. I walked slowly, spoke softly, and kept my eyes low. I let them believe grief had emptied me out. I let them believe I was lost without my mother. Every suggestion they made I agreed to. Every document they mentioned I said I would sign. At night I didn't sleep, I listened. I recorded, I learned. I discovered how long they had been waiting for my mother to die. How they had already divided everything among themselves. How my brother had debts. How my uncle needed money to save his business. How my aunt had always hated that my mother trusted me more than anyone else. I was no longer their son, nephew, or brother. I was a problem to be solved, so I let them solve it. I told my uncle I wanted him to handle the legal process. I said I trusted him. His eyes lit up like a man who had just won the lottery. He didn't even try to hide it. My brother brought papers for me to sign. Explaining them too quickly, assuming I wouldn't understand, I pretended not to. I signed slowly, carefully, exactly where I needed to. What they thought were property transfer documents were something else entirely: confessions, agreements, evidence. My mother's lawyer had prepared everything years ago, just in case. All I needed was their greed to finish the work. The day the court notices arrived, the house exploded. My aunt screamed that there must be a mistake. My uncle's hands shook as he read the charges: fraud, conspiracy, forgery. My brother accused me of betrayal, his voice cracking as if he were the victim. They surrounded me in my room that night, desperate and furious. "You planned this," my brother shouted. "You set us up." I looked at him calmly. For the first time since my mother died, my voice didn't shake. "You planned it first," I said. I just listened. They demanded answers. They wanted to know when I had changed, when I had become this person. I didn't explain. I didn't defend myself. I walked past them, picked up my bag, and left the house my mother had protected all her life. Weeks later, I donated the house through the trust, not to them, to a shelter that took care of people who had no families left. I opened it in my mother's name. I kept nothing except her letter. Before the legal cases destroyed what remained of their relationships, I sent each of them a copy of that letter. Not the documents, just her words. "Silence is your armor," she had written, "and patience is your revenge." Today I live somewhere quiet. No one knows my last name. Sometimes I miss the idea of family, but then I remember standing behind that wall, hearing laughter at my mother's death, and I realized something important. Losing everything didn't break me. Learning who deserved nothing from me, that's what finally set me free. And the most painful revenge of all wasn't taking anything from them. It was walking away with everything they could never touch. I didn't disappear overnight. Freedom doesn't work that way. It comes slowly, like learning how to breathe again after almost drowning. For a long time, every sound felt dangerous. A knock on the door made my chest tighten. A phone ringing felt like a threat. I kept my curtains closed, my routine simple, my presence small. Trauma doesn't end when revenge is complete. Sometimes it begins there. At night I replayed everything in my head. My mother's face, her weak smile, the way her fingers squeezed mine when she handed me that envelope, as if she already knew what would happen after she was gone. She had lived in that house surrounded by people who smiled at her while waiting for her to die. That realization hurt more than anything my family had done to me. I started visiting the shelter often. At first, just to check paperwork, then to sit quietly in the back room. The people there didn't ask questions. They didn't pretend. They didn't smile with hidden knives behind their teeth. Some of them had been betrayed worse than I had. Some had lost children, some had lost themselves. And somehow among strangers I felt safer than I ever had among blood. One evening a man there asked me why I looked angry even when I was calm. I didn't answer him. But that question stayed with me. Anger doesn't disappear just because you win. It changes shape, it turns inward, it asks uncomfortable questions. Like who you are when survival is no longer your only purpose. Months passed. Court cases dragged on. My family tried to reach me through mutual contacts, distant relatives, even fake apologies. I never responded. Silence had worked once. I wasn't about to abandon it now. Each message they sent felt less like guilt and more like panic. Not because they missed me, but because they were losing control. One night I finally opened the last page of my mother's letter. I had avoided it for a long time, afraid of what else she might have known. There will come a day, she wrote, when you will wonder if you became cruel like them. If you went too far. Remember this, protecting yourself is not cruelty. Choosing peace over poison is not weakness. That was the moment I understood something painful and freeing at the same time. Revenge had never been the goal. Survival had been, dignity had been. My mother didn't raise me to destroy others. She raised me to make sure no one destroyed me. Still, the past doesn't let go easily. One afternoon, I saw my brother by accident. He looked older, thinner. His confidence was gone, replaced by something fragile and hollow. He didn't see me at first. When he did, his face froze like he had seen a ghost. "Can we talk?" he asked. I could have walked away, I should have. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. We sat across from each other in a small cafe. He avoided eye contact. His hands shook when he picked up his cup. "We didn't think you'd fight back," he admitted quietly. "You were always quiet." I looked at him for a long time before responding. "Quiet doesn't mean blind," I said. "It means I was watching." He tried to explain pressure, fear, money. Excuses stacked on excuses, each one thinner than the last. At some point, he stopped talking and just stared at the table. "You ruined everything," he said. "No," I replied calmly. "You just lost access to what you thought belonged to you." When I left, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Closure isn't dramatic, it's subtle. It's realizing you no longer need answers from people who never cared about the truth. That night, I dreamed of my mother. She was standing in the doorway of the old house, sunlight behind her, her face peaceful. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Some messages don't require words. I woke up lighter. I started rebuilding, not materially but internally. I learned how to trust my instincts again, how to say no without guilt, how to exist without constantly preparing for betrayal. Healing wasn't linear. Some days were calm. Some days I felt like I was back behind that wall, listening to laughter meant to erase me. But each time I chose not to become what hurt me. Years later, people sometimes ask where I'm from. I give vague answers. I don't talk about inheritance or court cases or revenge. Not because I'm ashamed, but because my story no longer needs an audience. The truth is simple. I didn't win because I took everything from them. I won because I learned how to walk away without carrying their darkness with me. And sometimes, when the world is quiet, I still hear my mother's voice, not as a warning anymore, but as reassurance. "You survived," it says. And that was always enough. Time has a strange way of revealing what revenge cannot erase. I thought the story ended when I walked away, but life doesn't close chapters so neatly. It lets echoes remain, sometimes soft, sometimes cruel. There were nights when I sat alone in my apartment, lights off, city noise leaking through the windows, wondering who I would have been if my mother had lived longer. If my family had been different. If love had not come with conditions. Those thoughts didn't hurt the way they used to, but they still existed like scars you stop noticing until someone touches them. The shelter grew, slowly. Donations came from unexpected places. People didn't know my name, and that was intentional. I stayed in the background watching lives stabilize, watching people who had nothing slowly rebuild something that looked like hope. Every time I saw that, it felt like my mother was still doing good through me. One evening, an old woman at the shelter held my hand and said, "Your mother raised a good soul." She didn't know my story. She didn't know how close I had come to becoming someone colder, harder, darker. Her words hit me harder than any accusation ever had. That was when I realized something uncomfortable. I had spent so long protecting myself that I hadn't allowed myself to live. So I started small. I let people in, carefully. I learned how to listen without suspicion. I laughed without waiting for the moment it would be used against me. I failed sometimes. Trust isn't something you flip back on like a switch, but every risk I took felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been buried with my mother. Then, one day, the past knocked again. It came in the form of a letter, no return address. Just my name, written shackily. Inside was an apology. Not poetic, just tired. My aunt wrote that everything had fallen apart, that she lived alone now. That greed had cost her every relationship she thought she was securing. She said she didn't expect forgiveness. She just wanted me to know that she finally understood what she had lost. I read it once, then again. And then I burned it. Not out of anger, but out of acceptance. Some words arrive too late to change anything. Forgiveness doesn't always require a response. Sometimes it's simply refusing to reopen a door that finally closed. A few months later, I heard my uncle had passed away. Stress-related complications, people said. I didn't attend the funeral, I didn't send flowers, I didn't feel guilt either. Just a quiet acknowledgement that consequences are patient, and they always collect their debt. The strangest part was my brother. He kept trying. Messages that started angry slowly turned hollow, then desperate, then silent. Until one day there was nothing, no apology, no closure, just absence. And I understood that silence had claimed him the same way it had saved me. Years passed. I moved cities again, changed jobs, built a life that no one could trace back to pain unless I chose to tell it. People met me without expectations, without history. They saw me as I was, not as something to be used or inherited. Sometimes late at night I thought about the person I had been, the quiet one, the obedient one, the one who mistook endurance for loyalty. I didn't hate him. I respected him. He survived something brutal without becoming brutal himself. That, I realized, was the real victory. One evening while sorting through old belongings, I found my mother's letter again. The paper had yellowed, the ink had faded slightly, but her words were still steady. At the bottom, below everything I had already read 100 times, was something I had missed, a postscript. If one day you feel empty after winning, remember this: justice gives you closure, but purpose gives you peace. Choose purpose. I sat there for a long time. Revenge had closed a wound, but purpose had filled the space it left behind. That night, I made a decision. I expanded the trust. Not just shelters, but education, legal aid, quiet support for people who'd been betrayed by those closest to them. No publicity, no speeches, just impact. I stopped seeing my past as something that chased me. It became something that powered me. Sometimes people ask me why I don't talk about my family. I smile and say, I have one. They assume I mean the people around me. I don't correct them. Because family isn't blood, it's protection, it's loyalty when no one is watching. It's choosing not to harm someone even when you have every reason to. And in the end, the most satisfying revenge wasn't watching them fall. It was realizing that I no longer needed them to rise. I didn't inherit just property or money. I inherited clarity, and that changed everything. There was a time when I believed clarity was the final destination. That once you understood everything, who betrayed you, why it happened, and how you survived, it would all settle into peace. I was wrong. Clarity is not an ending. It's a responsibility. With clarity comes choice. I could have lived quietly forever, hidden behind new names and neutral smiles, pretending the past never happened. Many people do that. They survive, but they never truly live. I felt that danger creeping in, the comfort of emotional numbness, the safety of staying untouched. Pain can make isolation feel like wisdom. But my mother didn't raise me to disappear. She raised me to endure, yes, but also to stand. So I started speaking. Not publicly, not loudly. Just honestly, in rooms where honesty mattered. I began mentoring young men at the shelter, those who had been betrayed by family partners, systems that promised protection and delivered abandonment. I didn't tell them my story in full. I didn't need to. Pain recognizes pain without explanations. I taught them what no one had taught me early enough. How to document everything, how to trust patterns more than words, how silence can be strength, but only when paired with action. One of them once asked me, how do you forgive people who tried to destroy you? I didn't answer right away. Then I said, you don't forgive them for their sake. You forgive them so they stop living rent-free inside your head. Even as the words left my mouth, I realized I was still learning how to live them. Healing is not linear. Some days I woke up grounded and steady. Other days an old smell or sound dragged me back to that hallway, that wall, that laughter behind it. Trauma has a memory of its own. It doesn't care how far you've come. But I had learned something crucial. I was no longer powerless inside those memories. When they came, I didn't fight them. I didn't drown in them either. I let them pass like weather. Temporary. Uninvited, no longer in control. Years after everything collapsed, I received a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. It was my brother. His voice sounded unfamiliar, quieter, thinner, stripped of the arrogance I remembered. He didn't apologize. Not directly. He didn't accuse me either. He just said, I don't know who I am anymore. I listened for a long time. That surprised me. He told me about his failures. His isolation, how every relationship he touched eventually fell apart. How trust, once broken too many times, stops being something you receive and becomes something you must earn in silence. I see her sometimes, he said. In my dreams, she doesn't look at me. That was the moment I understood something final. Punishment had already happened. Life had done its work. I hope you find peace, I told him. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was closure without reunion. After the call ended, I didn't feel shaken. I felt resolved. Some chapters end without reconciliation, and that is not failure. That is maturity. I began writing, not to publish, not to perform, but to understand. I wrote about grief without villains, about betrayal without theatrics, about revenge without blood. I wrote about how silence can be weaponized, and how restraint can be more terrifying than rage. One night, rereading something I had written, I realized the story no longer centered on them. That's when I knew I was free. Freedom isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, when you stop checking behind you to see if the past is still chasing you. I built a life where my values were non-negotiable, where loyalty was earned, not assumed, where love didn't demand self-erasure as proof. I learned to choose people who chose me back without calculation. Sometimes, people still romanticize revenge. They ask if it felt good, if it was worth it. I tell them the truth. Revenge didn't feel good. It felt necessary. What felt good came after, when I no longer needed it. When justice was no longer a hunger, but a memory. I keep my mother's letter in a drawer now, not on my desk. I don't need to read it to feel guided. Her lessons live in my decisions, in the way I pause before reacting, in the way I walk away instead of proving a point, in the way I protect my future without poisoning it. If there is one thing this journey taught me, it's this. The most dangerous person is not the one who seeks revenge. It's the one who survives betrayal, gains power, and still chooses restraint, because that person cannot be controlled by fear, greed, or guilt. And that kind of freedom, that's the inheritance no one can ever steal. I realized over time that freedom is not the same as peace. Peace is quiet, freedom is motion. It's movement without hesitation, without the shadow of fear guiding every step. When I first walked away from the house, I thought the world had already decided for me what freedom would feel like. I was wrong. It takes years to truly inhabit the body of someone who has been nearly erased, someone who has been watched, judged, and betrayed by those who claim to love them. You can survive betrayal, but living afterward is the challenge. In the months that followed, I changed my routines. I moved cities, started fresh, but the scars were always there, just beneath the surface. Every time I saw a family gathering, a funeral, or even a casual reunion, my heart skipped a beat. Memories that I had thought buried came rushing back. Laughter, whispers, the cold calculation I had overheard behind that living room wall, it haunted me. And yet with each haunting, I felt stronger, more certain that I could not, and would not ever let someone else define my value again. I began documenting my days, not for anyone else but for myself. I wrote down every thought, every lingering doubt, every memory of betrayal. I didn't filter, I didn't justify. Writing became a way to exorcise the ghost of my past, to give the events names, faces, and reasons. Over time, I discovered that narrating my trauma allowed me to step outside it. I could observe my own life as if from a distance, finally understanding the power I had never realized I possessed. During this period, I also reconnected with the world in a way I hadn't allowed myself before. I started volunteering quietly, with organizations helping people who had faced betrayal, abandonment, or abuse. The work was tedious, often unglamorous, and emotionally draining, but it grounded me. Each person I helped reminded me of my own survival and how I could extend the lessons of resilience beyond myself. For the first time, I felt agency that wasn't tied to revenge or legal battles. My power became constructive, not destructive. I still think about my family sometimes. Not often, but enough to know that their absence is permanent. My aunt, my uncle, my brother, they all made choices that left irreparable cracks. I realized that my detachment wasn't cold, it was survival. Detachment allowed me to live without the constant stress of manipulation. I didn't forgive them, not yet. Maybe I never would. But their absence no longer dictated the quality of my life. One winter evening, sitting by a window in my new apartment, I watched the city glow under streetlights, snow reflecting like broken glass. I thought of the man I was, sitting behind that wall, listening to conversations meant to terrify me, and I almost smiled. That person had been cautious, silent, afraid. But he had survived. And from that survival, someone stronger emerged. Someone who could endure injustice, absorb betrayal, and still choose dignity over rage. A letter arrived that night. Not from my family, not from anyone I knew. It was a simple note from someone I had helped years ago. A young man who had faced parental betrayal. He wrote that my advice had saved him from making mistakes that could have ruined his life. Reading his words, I realized something profound. My story, my suffering, my revenge, had created the capacity to guide someone else toward survival. That was when I understood that legacy is not in inheritance or property. It is in the impact you leave on people who are still capable of growth. I started paying closer attention to my emotions. I allowed myself to feel happiness, small but meaningful. I allowed myself to love cautiously, not recklessly. I met people who were curious, kind, and authentic. I listened without judgment, spoke without suspicion, and gave trust selectively but fully. This was harder than any revenge plot I had orchestrated, because trust is never guaranteed. It has to be nurtured. And nurturing is vulnerable. Years passed and life grew quieter. My mother's letter remained in a drawer, untouched but always nearby. Her voice, her guidance, her warnings, they lived in my instincts, not in paper. I no longer needed evidence of her foresight. I acted with clarity, purpose, and patience, because survival without purpose is hollow. I had inherited not just property, but the wisdom to navigate life without being consumed by resentment. Then, one evening, I received an unexpected message. My brother, his tone was careful, almost hesitant. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't make excuses. He simply said, "I need to understand how you survived. I can't live in the shadow of what I lost." I read his message several times before answering. I could have ignored it. I could have condemned him. I could have re-engaged in the psychological games he had once used against me. But none of that mattered anymore. Survival is not about satisfying an old score. It is about controlling what you can, your choices, your emotions. I replied carefully, saying only what was necessary. You can start by understanding yourself. Only then will you understand what it means to survive betrayal without becoming it. Silence followed. Days, weeks, months. And eventually, his attempts to contact me stopped. I didn't pursue, I didn't need to. My closure was not dependent on his repentance or understanding. My closure depended entirely on my ability to live fully, honestly, and intentionally. I rebuilt my life entirely on this principle. I didn't just survive my family's greed and betrayal, I transcended it. I built a career, friendships, and a life grounded in integrity, empathy, and independence. I made peace with solitude. I learned that loneliness is not weakness, it is a tool for reflection, strategy, and growth. I never needed anyone's validation to define my worth. Yet, there were moments of reflection that pierced deeper than revenge ever could. I realized that revenge is a temporary satisfaction, a fleeting feeling of control. It never fills the void left by betrayal. What fills that void is purpose. The purpose I discovered is unshakable because it does not depend on others. It is sustained by action, compassion, and a life lived deliberately. One day, while walking through a park, I saw a young boy helping a stray dog. I paused watching him. His simplicity, his innocence, his small acts of care, it reminded me that life is fragile, and every moment of kindness is a rebellion against cruelty. In that moment, I understood fully that the greatest revenge against a life that tried to break you is to thrive authentically, with generosity, strength, and calm resilience. No one can predict the timing of peace, or the form it will take. I had expected relief, a sense of completion, a final victory. What came instead was a slow awakening. I realized that surviving betrayal and achieving revenge were only the first step. Living without allowing past trauma to dictate my choices, that was the ultimate triumph. Now, when I think about my mother, I don't think about grief. I think about strategy, courage, and foresight. I think about the letter she left me and the lessons it contained, and how those lessons guided every decision I made. My family's betrayal no longer lives in my chest, it is a shadow behind me, shrinking with every choice I make to live fully. The world outside my windows is still imperfect. People still lie, manipulate, and betray. I will face challenges, disappointments, and moments that test my patience. But I have built armor that no one can pierce, not violence, not deceit, not greed. This armor is built from clarity, self-respect, and the decision to never allow others to define my life. And in the quiet moments, I finally understand what my mother meant: surviving is not enough. You must rise, you must transform suffering into purpose. That is the inheritance she truly left me. The rest, the property, the trust, the wealth, was just a tool. The real legacy is in becoming unbreakable, kind, and deliberate. Regardless of what anyone else does, I am free. Not because they fell, not because revenge was complete, but because I no longer allow my past to define my present. I no longer allow fear, anger, or resentment to dictate my choices. I am free because I have learned the most important truth. The only life worth living is one in which I am the author of my own story, undeterred by the betrayal, greed, or cruelty of others. Freedom, purpose, and resilience, these are the treasures that no inheritance, no court, no revenge can ever take away, and that is the legacy I carry forward silently, deliberately, and irrevocably. Time moves differently when you've survived something meant to destroy you. Days blend, nights stretch, and memories seep into the quiet moments when you think you are alone. But I learned something crucial: surviving betrayal is not about ignoring the past, it's about transforming it. The house my mother left me, the letters she wrote, the carefully orchestrated plan for revenge, they were tools, not endpoints. The real work began after the dust settled, when the world expected me to collapse, when my family assumed their greed had won. That was the moment I realized survival without transformation is meaningless. I began waking earlier than usual, moving through the city while it still slept, learning to observe life without judgment. Small details that would have gone unnoticed before: an old man feeding birds, children chasing stray dogs, street musicians laughing despite harsh winds, became my anchors. I started keeping journals again, not just of events, but of emotions, strategies, thoughts that might otherwise slip away. The act of writing became a ritual, a bridge between my fractured past and the life I was quietly building. I wrote about betrayal, revenge, grief, resilience, and the strange liberation that comes from letting go of hate without letting go of lessons. Occasionally I would cross paths with reminders of my family. A name mentioned in conversation, a distant relative's social media post, a court notice forwarded through an old contact. Each time my instincts tensed, but then I would breathe, smile faintly, and continue walking. That tension, the instinct to react, to argue, confront, was once my prison. Now, it was my measure of growth. I could feel my old self, the one who trembled behind walls, still present, but quieter, wiser, stronger. I had integrated him rather than abandoned him. That integration, I realized, was freedom. Over time, I expanded my mother's trust into initiatives she would have quietly approved of. Shelters for those abandoned, mentorship programs for children betrayed by family, legal support for those manipulated or exploited. I never sought recognition. Publicity would have defeated the purpose. The work became its own reward. Watching lives stabilize, witnessing confidence rebuilt, seeing someone walk tall after years of being broken. Those were the victories I craved. They weren't flashy, they weren't loud, but they were profound. I was creating ripples from a life that had nearly drowned. There were still nights when shadows returned. Dreams of the living room, whispers of schemes, the cold laughter of my aunt and uncle behind walls they visited. But they no longer frightened me. I faced each echo of the past with calm observation. I acknowledged the feelings, but I didn't allow them to dictate my actions. Fear, rage, grief, they became tools, not masters. I had mastered the art of existing in my own skin, unafraid of ghosts, unbound by others' choices. One day, years later, a letter arrived. It was from my brother. He wrote cautiously, almost humbly. He did not ask forgiveness. He did not apologize in a way that demanded a response. He simply wrote about the emptiness of his life, about the collapse of relationships, about the consequences of greed and deceit. And then he asked one question: how did you survive and still find peace? I read his words and felt a strange mix of detachment and pity. I did not respond immediately. I didn't need to. Weeks later, I sent a brief note: peace is a choice, not a consequence of revenge. Learn it before seeking it. And that was enough. That was closure, not for him but for me. I began to truly understand what my mother meant by purpose. Survival had been necessary, but purpose was transformative. I wasn't defined by what my family had done, nor by the pain I had endured. I was defined by the choices I made afterward, the quiet, deliberate, often invisible choices that sculpted my life in alignment with my values. I began taking risks that were not reckless but intentional. I let trust return in measured doses. I let connection happen without expecting perfection. I allowed myself to love cautiously but fully, understanding that vulnerability was not weakness but proof of growth. Eventually, I realized something almost terrifying: I had outlived my past. My mother's letters were no longer crutches but maps. The trauma that once dominated my thoughts had become a tool for understanding others. I had transformed my pain into empathy, my betrayal into strategy, my revenge into wisdom. Every step I took was deliberate, not reactive. Every relationship I nurtured was chosen, not accidental. I had become the person my younger self could never have imagined: strong, resilient, aware, and free. The final lesson came quietly. One evening, walking through a park, I saw a stray dog struggling to survive in freezing weather. A child approached it, offering warmth and food. I watched them and something clicked. Life is full of betrayal, cruelty, and loss. But life is also full of resilience, kindness, and quiet victories. My revenge, my survival, my carefully orchestrated justice, they had one ultimate purpose: to allow me to live fully, and to ensure that my energy contributed to growth rather than destruction. The realization was liberating. My mother had taught me this all along, and I had finally understood it. True victory is measured not by what you take, but by what you create in the aftermath. I stopped looking over my shoulder entirely. The past no longer dictated my pace. I no longer checked for signs of betrayal, traps, or manipulation. I moved forward with confidence, fully inhabiting my life. My mother's inheritance had been more than money or property. It had been a blueprint for strength, patience, and vision. I had inherited the capacity to transform suffering into purpose, to transcend vengeance, and to create life from the ashes of destruction. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when I still remembered the house, the whispers, the wall behind which I had crouched. Those memories did not sadden me. They reminded me of what I had endured and, more importantly, what I had become. I was no longer the scared, broken child overhearing schemes. I was a man shaped by every betrayal, strengthened by every hardship, and guided by every lesson my mother had left behind. In the end, I realized that the most potent form of revenge was not destruction, exposure, or humiliation. It was transformation. To take a life that tried to break you and to craft a life of purpose, resilience, and impact. That is the revenge that lasts, the legacy that cannot be stolen, the inheritance that endures beyond generations. I walk through life now knowing that I am unshakable. I have learned to act without fear, to give without expectation, and to love without hesitation. I have learned that power lies not in retaliation but in restraint, not in anger but in clarity, not in vengeance but in purpose. My mother's plan, my inheritance, and my survival were never about revenge alone. They were about teaching me how to rise fully, above the shadows of greed, betrayal, and cruelty. And so I live, not in the past, not in what was taken, but in the life I have deliberately chosen. The house, the letters, the documents, they are behind me now. I carry only lessons, strength, and purpose. The family that betrayed me fades in memory, powerless to touch the life I have built. I have inherited not wealth, not property, but mastery over my own existence, the knowledge that nothing can define me except the choices I make. Freedom is not a gift, it is earned. Peace is not automatic, it is cultivated. And revenge, the kind that matters, is not a single act but a lifetime of decisions, each one deliberate, each one shaping a life untouched by malice. I am free, I am whole, and I am no longer defined by those who sought to destroy me. I am defined by what I have created, what I continue to build, and the quiet certainty that no one can ever take from me what I carry within: clarity, purpose, and an unshakable resolve to live fully, deliberately, and without fear. And that is how I came home from a funeral with a secret inheritance and turned the betrayal of my family into a life they could never touch, a life they could never ruin, and a legacy that will endure long after their names fade from memory.